How are you? I know, it's amazing to be here in a sea of vegans, a large room completely packed with people working to make the world a better place for animals. Nothing inspires me more, so thank you so much. And I love having the opportunity to stand up in front of a group of vegans who are often so committed and working so hard to make the world a better place for animals, and being able to share good news, like how the vegan movement is growing exponentially all over the world, which it is. The movement is growing all over the world, and that's amazing. Today, I'm actually going to talk about something else that's growing, and it's growing within the vegan movement. And this is a virus of sorts. It is a virus that is contagious, it is debilitating, and it can be potentially even deadly. But in this, there is also good news, because when we recognize this virus, then with awareness of this virus, then we're in a position to prevent it from spreading, to reverse its course, and ultimately to heal our movement. And the virus I'm talking about today is toxic communication among vegans. Now, before I talk about toxic communication and define it, what exactly it is, I'm going to just show you a few examples. Can you see this to read yourselves? Is it people in the back large enough on the screen? Okay. I had a lot of examples to choose from, unfortunately, and just chose 4 of them to give you a sense of some of the problems that we'll be talking about today. And I'm just curious, before moving on, how many of you have witnessed toxic communication? This is vegan to vegan. Okay, I didn't even finish the question and all the hands went up. So you know what I'm talking about. And this is a really serious problem in the movement. There are countless vegans who have been the target of toxic communication, myself included. I have, in fact, talked to vegan after vegan after vegan, some of them who are brilliant leaders, brilliant organizational leaders, who have shared with me these deeply painful stories of how they were targets of toxic communication. Some of them actually felt like they couldn't even continue in their careers as vegans. And in fact, in my experience and in my observation, more vegans, or at least a lot of vegans, end up leaving the movement, not because they can't withstand the pressure of the dominant carnistic culture, but because of this sense of betrayal and demoralization that they feel when they're attacked by their own people, by other vegans. How many of you can relate to this, or have seen this before, felt this yourself? This feeling of being betrayed by the people who are supposed to understand the most. So this is a serious problem. And I'm going to talk now first for a few minutes about what exactly I mean when I refer to toxic communication. Now, toxic communication is any communication that violates our integrity and harms the dignity of others. And I'm going to define this for you. So integrity is the integration of core moral values, such as compassion and justice, and practices. It's practicing what we preach. We violate our integrity whenever we communicate in a way that doesn't reflect compassion and justice. Make sense? Dignity is one sense of intrinsic worth. We feel a sense of dignity when we feel that we are fundamentally worthy as beings on this planet, when we feel like we're not less than or less worthy on a basic fundamental level than others. So we violate another's dignity whenever we communicate that they are somehow less than, particularly when we shame them. So when we shame somebody, we are communicating that they are less worthy than. Shame is an incredibly toxic emotion. In fact, it is arguably one of the most, if not the most, damaging and destructive of all human emotions. So I want to talk briefly about this emotion for a minute. And I want to start out by differentiating shame and guilt. Very often people use these terms interchangeably. But there's a difference between them. Does anybody here know what the difference is? Do you want to shout it out? What is it? What is guilt? What's the definition of guilt?
Maybe guilt is what you feel, and maybe shame is what you think the others think about you.
So maybe guilt is what you feel and shame is what you think others think about you. Well, it can be that way, but that's not exactly the definition. Anybody else want to give it a go? Guilt comes from inside, shame comes from outside, but we can shame ourselves, and other people can cause us to feel guilty, actually. So the difference is that guilt is how we feel about our behaviors, right? We feel guilty when we think to ourselves, I did something bad. Shame is how we feel about what? Exactly, ourselves. We feel ashamed when we think, I am bad. So shame is the feeling of being less than, and more specifically, it's the shame of being less worthy than. And as I said, it is one of the most disruptive and destructive of all human emotions. Most of us carry around a great deal of shame already, because we've been born into a deeply dysfunctional, profoundly non-relational, screwed up world that shames us on an ongoing basis. We have not learned how to relate to one another in a basically compassionate, healthy, and relational way. And so a lot of our communication, a lot of our interactions are shaming. Most of us carry around a lot of shame, and most of us, understandably, are deeply defended against feeling further shame. We protect ourselves from being further shamed in a variety of ways, and we hide our shame from others and also from ourselves. We bury our shame underneath our many successes. We hide it within being the best activist, the best employee, the most beautiful person we can be, etc., etc. We work on hiding our shame from others and ourselves. We pretend that we're not ashamed to ourselves because many of us have learned to feel ashamed of being ashamed. I often say that one of the best ways to get somebody to do the opposite of what you want them to do is to shame them. Shamed people are not people who are thinking about taking or feel capable of taking positive action on behalf of others or themselves. Shamed people are in defense mode. They are working to prevent being further shamed. They wrap themselves in the emotional armor to keep themselves safe. Shamed people typically withdraw or attack in self-defense. So we have this epidemic of shame and this epidemic of shaming behaviors and this epidemic of hiding our shame from ourselves. And yet many of us continue to use shame, believing that it's actually going to motivate people to change. Often the opposite is more likely to happen. When people feel shamed, studies have shown when people feel that their dignity is not being honored, they become defensive. They exhibit a stress response. This means that they're in kind of quasi fight or flight mode. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's weaker. What people do when they're in defensive mode is they become less rational, they have less access to their rationality, and they also become less empathic. They're not going to be empathically connected to somebody who's shaming them. And when you think about a lot of communication, vegan communication, what do you notice? Communicating to non-vegans. A lot of our tactics, right, are shaming. And when we communicate with one another, a lot of our communication is in fact shaming. And this is not only unproductive, but it's deeply, profoundly counterproductive. Shame is also contagious. When we shame others, we increase the likelihood that they will go out and shame others as well, as a way of managing shame. One way that people manage feeling less than is looking for others who they can make feel less than they are. Make sense? So shame is contagious. And in fact, toxic communication is contagious. Studies have shown, for example, that being exposed to just one incident of rude behavior, like reading an insulting email, can cause people to reproduce these negative behaviors. Studies have also shown that for every hurtful interaction we have, it takes at least 5 positive ones to offset the harm done to our mood and the drain done to our energy. So this is a 1 to 5 ratio. That's significant. Studies have also shown that people automatically mimic the facial expressions, tone, and postures of others, as do spectators to the encounter. So if somebody is behaving in a toxic way, even the people who are onlookers will mimic these facial expressions and behaviors. And when we see people making negative or hurtful expressions, such as frowning or glaring, we actually feel angrier or worse ourselves. So toxic communication, which is the primary expression of toxic behaviors, is contagious. Now, just imagine the impact of toxic communication when it's expressed not just one-to-one, but to hundreds or thousands of others, as when somebody is on a stage or somebody is posting on Facebook. And imagine the increase in this impact when that individual is in a position of leadership or authority. So those of us who are in positions of leadership have a responsibility to use our influence to offset rather than reinforce this toxicity. It is incredibly important that we are careful with what we are modeling and how we are communicating. This toxic communication in our movement is creating an epidemic of suffering, and it is doing tremendous harm and damage to vegans, to vegan organizations, and also to the vegan movement. Now, there have been interesting studies done on toxic behaviors in the workplace, and I'm going to share with you some of these findings. There are more that I could share, but I couldn't fit them on the slide. Some of the costs of our toxic communication within a workplace setting. So this could be easily extrapolated or applied to a vegan organization and, of course, to the vegan movement as a whole. So these are just some of the results of toxic communication in a workplace setting. And I'm not going to read them out. You can just read them yourself. Is any of this familiar to you? In some of your work, your organizations, your groups, your interactions? And what's interesting is that these problems are not only problems that are experienced by the direct recipient of toxic communication, but the indirect victims, which are the first or second-hand witnesses to these toxic communications, are also impacted in a similar way. So the indirect victims are either people who are onlookers, who are actually directly witnessing the interaction, or people who somebody who's been hurt tells later at the end of the day. So if you experience this, for example, with your volunteer group, and you go home and you tell your partner about it, then your partner can also be impacted in a negative way from hearing this. Studies have also found that just one person who engages in toxic behaviors in a group reduces the group's performance by between 30 and 40%. Just think about that number for a moment. In a movement that needs all of the energy and all of the resources it can get to address this massive, massive global problem of animal harm and suffering. Studies have found, researchers estimated that the financial costs alone of a toxic workplace, and a toxic workplace they looked at, which they defined as having 15% of employees engaging in toxic interactions. If you have a staff of 1,000 and 15% of them engage in toxic interactions, the cost is over $2 million. So let's think about what some of these numbers might mean if we applied them to a vegan organization in the vegan movement. So let's assume, let's say we're talking about an organization of 100 people. The cost would be about $200,000 in lost productivity. Let's say we're talking about an organization of 10 people, which is even more common among vegan organizations. The cost in lost productivity would be about $20,000. And let's look at what this means in terms of harm to animals when we're talking about an efficient vegan organization. An efficient vegan organization is estimated to be able to spare one animal for every $1 spent. So let's look at the cost to the animals in an efficient vegan organization. In an organization or an efficient vegan organization of 10 people, this is 20,000 animals who were not spared who could have been. In a larger organization of 100 people, this would be 200,000 animals who were not spared, whose lives might otherwise have been. Now, even if these estimates are wildly off, even if they're 80% higher than they should be, this is 20% too many animals than most vegans would ever be comfortable with. An imperfect but perhaps useful analogy is to think of farmed animals being in a sinking ship. And their main hope of survival is a lifeboat that's personed by vegans. Every toxic communication is like shooting a hole in the bottom of the animal's lifeboat. This is a problem that we can't afford to leave unaddressed. Now, I'm going to actually talk about how to address this. What are some specific actions we can take? But first, I'm going to just briefly talk about what has caused this epidemic of toxic interaction in the first place. There are a lot of reasons. I'm actually writing about those separately, but I'm just going to name a few of the ones that I think are most important to be aware of right now. One reason is because most communication today is online, and it's a lot easier to be mean to somebody if you're not looking them in the eye, and we know that. So whenever possible, a really simple step we can take is to communicate with a person face to face. Even if it's a person we only know through Facebook, we can ask them to meet us on video chat instead of having a battle that everybody can look on to, a battle of comments. Another reason is because the broader emotional and intellectual climate, the intellectual and emotional climate of the broader culture has become toxic. So toxic communications have become so normal as to be unremarkable. I am constantly surprised at how everyday communication, which is so often so shaming and so harmful, is just not even noticeable to so many people. So this is a problem that goes beyond the vegan movement, of course. And the third reason that I'll mention today is because in many movements, and particularly in the vegan movement, there are high rates of traumatization. We live in the midst of a global atrocity that is carnism. A global atrocity is a mass traumatic event. And when we are living in the midst of a mass traumatic event, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to become at least somewhat traumatized by this, traumatized by the reality of what's happening in the world that we happen to be aware of, and a lot of the graphic imagery that many of us have witnessed. Many of us in the movement have what's referred to as STSD, secondary traumatic stress disorder. How many of you here have heard of STSD? I'm just curious. I gave a talk on it a few years ago. So maybe some of you are at that. Maybe some of you have, how many of you know PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? Okay, so this is like what combat veterans experience sometimes. STSD is exactly like PTSD, except with one key difference. Does anyone know what that difference is? Exactly. STSD impacts the witnesses to the violence rather than the direct victims of the violence. So many vegans have STSD, and I have a chapter in my new book, Beyond Beliefs, specifically about this. It's really important to get informed about it, because when we are traumatized to a greater or lesser degree, this has an impact on our perceptions, our feelings, and our behaviors, and it is one of the drivers of some of the common toxic communication patterns we see in our movement. For example, when we have STSD or even some level of traumatization, we can develop what I refer to as a trauma narrative. In other words, we start to look at the world as though it's one giant traumatic event with only 3 roles to be played. Either you're a victim. If you're not a victim, what are you? A perpetrator or a hero. And the witness is tricky, because a witness can also be a victim or a hero, a perpetrator, depending on how they, or a hero, depending on how they act. So it's victim, perpetrator, and hero. And the more traumatized we get, the more we start to place everyone, including ourselves, into one of these roles and place rigid boundaries in between them. Like, you can't be both. You have to be one or the other. And the stronger our emotional reaction are to them. So we believe if you're not a hero, like if you're not 100% vegan 100% of the time, then you must be what? A perpetrator. So we have this kind of like perfectionism that we've started to develop, and this is in large part, in my opinion, because of the level of traumatization many of us have experienced. When I talk to vegans about trauma, and I do very often, I talk about the problem of over-witnessing. The problem of, like, so many vegans who feel an obligation to continue to watch these graphic movies and to look at these graphic images. Can you relate to this a bit? It's a lot of vegans feel this way, and these graphic movies are like feeding the trauma. If you already know what's happening in the world, you don't need to keep watching these things. They can reinforce your traumatic response. But many vegans have said to me, well, I feel guilty not watching. I feel like, compared to what the animals go through, the least I can do is to bear witness to them, to watch, 2 minutes of their suffering. The animals don't need a movement of walking trauma survivors. The animals need a movement of healthy, self-connected people who are able to be in this movement for the long haul and not eventually burn out. And witnessing more than necessary, is one of the key contributors to burnout in the movement. Vegans often say that they're afraid that if they stop witnessing, if they stop watching these graphic videos, then they'll stop caring. They'll stop wanting to fight the good fight. Now, I've never in my career seen that happen. In fact, I've seen the opposite more often, where vegans become more motivated, but they're motivated not from a place of trauma, but from a healthier place inside of themselves. It can be helpful to think of your trauma as having a survival instinct, as being like an entity, a living being with a survival instinct that has taken up residence in your heart and in your mind. And it wants to stay alive, and the way it keeps itself alive is by convincing you to continue feeding it, by continuing to take in more traumatic material. So I suggest that you consider giving yourself permission to let your trauma go. And it might be uncomfortable, but see what happens for you. When you give yourself permission to let your trauma go, you significantly reduce the likelihood that you'll engage in some of these toxic behaviors and communications that we've been talking about. And you will have a more sustainable life as an activist and as a person. Now, this combination of this toxic, broader intellectual and emotional culture and, online culture and secondary traumatic stress has led to a culture of this kind of moral perfectionism, whereby we hold others and ourselves often to impossible standards. Like one unexamined statement or one selfish choice or statement, suddenly makes someone bad, suddenly makes us the enemy. We have no wiggle room to screw up. We have no wiggle room to not be perfect. And this is a very dangerous state for us to be in the movement. The ethos today, that's like the broader backdrop of the vegan movement and beyond, in the broader culture in some ways, is one in which we not only tolerate, but we also celebrate this moral perfectionism and toxic communication. We have learned to rally around those who raise the battle cry of moral righteousness and elevate them, put them on this pedestal, and to believe that it's all right to abuse others as long as we're morally outraged when we're doing it. This is a very dangerous attitude for us to be embracing. And research on anger and on perceptions of people who are angry has actually shown that we are less rational when it comes to assessing the behaviors of people who are perceived as people who are angry. We see people who are expressing anger as more believable, as more competent, and more intelligent than they actually are. So I want to talk for a minute about anger. And some of you might be thinking, but of course we're angry. We're supposed to be angry. We're supposed to be morally outraged. Look what's happening in the world. So I want to differentiate healthy from unhealthy anger for a minute. Anger is a normal, healthful, legitimate emotion that arises as a response to injustice. We need our anger. Our anger is what makes us take a stand against injustice. Anger becomes unhealthy or problematic when we become blended, when it's anger that we're blended with, and when it has within it the charge of contempt. And I'm going to explain both of these concepts. So when we're blended with our anger, it means we don't see any difference between our anger and ourselves. We often express it, I am angry, as the anger and we are one. A more accurate way of expressing anger would be, I am feeling angry about, or even better, a part of me is feeling angry about this, because it's usually a part of us that's feeling angry, not 100% of us. So when we're blended with our anger, we are looking at the issue, we are looking at the world through the eyes of our anger. When we are not blended with our anger, we're still able to be connected with our rational selves, with our empathy, with our compassion, even as we feel our healthy anger. Does that make sense? And problematic anger is anger that has the charge of contempt. Contempt is the emotion, it's judgment plus hate. Essentially, it's judgment and anger and hate actually together. When we feel contempt, what this means is that we have placed ourselves in a position of moral superiority. We are perceiving the other, or sometimes ourselves. We can feel contempt to ourselves as well. All of this communication, all of what I'm talking about applies to how we treat and communicate with ourselves as well. So when we feel contempt, we are perceiving another or ourselves as morally inferior in some way. If we assume that our anger, unhealthy anger, causes us to adopt this problematic assumption, if we assume that our anger gives us license not to practice basic human decency toward others, then we can end up feeding rather than fixing the very problem that our anger is trying to transform. So we need to be careful to develop enough self-awareness so that we can reflect on ourselves when we're angry and ask ourselves if we are feeling and using our anger productively or destructively. Because how we use our anger and how we relate to our anger will make all the difference. Now, let me back up for a minute. I want to also point out that anger is healthy anger, or not to confuse how we express anger with tone policing. You guys have heard this expression, tone policing, before? Okay, so the idea of, tone policing is basically telling people that they should not be communicating about an issue if they're feeling strong emotions around it or if they're expressing strong emotions around it. That's a problem. It's normal, natural, and necessary and healthy to feel and express our emotions around issues. Tone policing is not the same as asking somebody to communicate respectfully when they're feeling angry. So I don't want to mix up these two concepts. So I want to talk briefly about moving beyond this perfectionism before we move into how to communicate in a way that is less toxic or not toxic. The first step is in our attitudes. We need to appreciate that we have inherited a messy world. We have been born into an absolute mess of a world. And you guys don't need me to tell you that. You're all very well aware of this, no doubt. We have to learn to relate to the world the way the world is, rather than the way that we wish the world were. Instead of getting angry that it's raining, take out an umbrella. When we relate to the world differently, we have to make choices in the world that we have inherited that are very different than the choices we would make in an ideal world. We have to learn to live with contradictions in our lives because we don't have any choice. Even as we hold people accountable, even as we work to change problematic attitudes and behaviors, we need to have some wiggle room to appreciate that many people are doing the best they can in a very problematic world. Maybe you're a vegan and you feed your sick cats meat because they can't live on vegan food. It's not possible for them. That's a contradiction you may just have to make your peace with and live with. It's not a contradiction you would have to deal with if the world were ideal. We wouldn't have cats living with us probably in the first place. So we need to appreciate that, number one, perfectionism is impossible to achieve. Everything can be made more perfect. Everything can be improved somehow. And we're living in a situation where perfectionism or even trying to be perfect is quite difficult and impossible. So we need to stop reproducing the toxic perfectionism and the toxic communication of the dominant culture. And we can do better. The vegan movement, veganism was established, in order to offset these toxic attitudes and behaviors that are normal in the dominant culture. Our movement was founded on compassion and on justice. We are doing better in many ways, and we can do better when it comes to this, changing our communication patterns. So I'm going to actually talk now. I originally, when I put this presentation together, had like 50 tips for preventing toxic communication, but we don't have time for 50 tips. I do cover effective communication very thoroughly in my new book, Beyond Beliefs. But here I'm going to talk about 8 key tips in order to prevent the spread of toxic communication. The first one is to examine yourself and your own behaviors. Many people have, not everybody, but many people have inflated beliefs about how well they treat others and how well they are seen by others. Particularly examine yourself and how you relate to people based on how much power they have in their relationship with you. This is something most of us don't pay attention to. It's good to become a self-observer in this way. And notice when somebody has power, more power than you do you tend to treat them with more respect than you treat people with less power than you have? If that's the case, then it's important for you to change the way that you relate across the board. And pay attention to the company you keep. If you surround yourself with people for whom toxic communication is normal and normalized, you're going to be very likely to slip into this pattern of communication yourself. If you're around people who are more conscious and are not communicating in a toxic way, your tolerance for toxic communication will be a lot lower. And when you get exposed to it and you notice it, you will feel how toxic it actually is. You'll kind of cleanse yourself of it. So then when you're re-exposed to it, you'll feel the toxicity even more. And this includes being online. Be careful how much you expose yourself to online toxic communication so it doesn't become normalized. Point 2 is to become a critical consumer of what you put in your heart and your mind, just like you are of what you put in your body and on your body. So, for example, notice the signs of toxic communication and distance yourself from them and don't use them yourselves. For example, shouting. And this might look like just using all capital letters and multiple exclamation points, and sometimes just one exclamation point. Using absolutes, okay, communicating where you say, for example, men rather than some men, or meat eaters rather than some meat eaters. Use sexist language, or eat animals, or have negative attitudes toward vegans. Notice character assaults. This is when people conflate a behavior with a character, right? So, for example, when somebody says she's speciesist because she says something speciesist, or he's sexist because he says or does something sexist. When you're born into dominant systems like speciesism and sexism, carnism, racism, you have absorbed, all of us have absorbed these systems into our mentality so deeply that we will never, probably never be fully free of them. What we need to do is to be committed to continuing to examine ourselves, becoming self-observers, becoming more literate so that we can practice the values of compassion and justice more fully. But if somebody says something sexist, that's normal. We can point it out to them, we can help raise awareness, but as soon as you label a person's character because of a behavior, you really shut down, you really decrease the likelihood that that person is going to be open to any other feedback. That person will likely feel shamed. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is exaggerated, making exaggerated claims rather than sticking to the facts. So, saying something like Joe's malicious statements, rather than saying statements that Joe made that I experienced as offensive. Malicious shows that you know what Joe's intentions were. Do you know he was intending to hurt? We can't possibly know that. All we can know is what we observe and our perceptions of what we observe. Defining reality. Defining reality is like we define others' reality when we make ourselves experts on the other's internal experience. When we act like we're mind readers. When we know what somebody else is thinking or feeling or needing or what their motivations are, which we can't possibly know. When we define another's reality, it's fundamentally disrespectful. It's often shaming. It often triggers anger in the other person, understandably and rightly, and it's a very disconnecting behavior. So defining reality is saying something like, he doesn't care about animals, he's just trying to feed his ego. And this is said sometimes about vegans who practice veganism in a way that other vegans don't like. Oh, he doesn't really care about animals. Oh, that organization doesn't really want to help animals. They just want to make lots of money for themselves. How on earth does anybody know that? How can any of us know what is inside somebody else's heart and mind? Allowing others to be the expert on their own experience is fundamentally respectful, and it's a generosity we all deserve, and it's a relational behavior. It creates connection and openness rather than disconnection and closed-mindedness. So a couple more suggestions. Avoid any communication that suggests that the other is somehow less than, that is shaming. And this can be kind of difficult, especially when it comes to like intellectual or academic critiques. I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but often academic critiques or intellectual critiques or communications that are very eloquent or use lots of big words are cleverly worded ways of communicating something that's shaming and that's toxic. So be especially, wary when you read an intellectual critique that's criticizing somebody else's work. It may very well be an accurate criticism, and it may also be a criticism that's done in such a way as to be shaming. Point 3 is to create a healthy process when we're communicating. Now, all communications have these two parts. They have a content and a process. When we're communicating, the content is what we are communicating about. It's the subject, right? So the content of this communication now is communication. So the content is what we are talking about, and the process is, what do you think? It's how, right? It's how we are communicating. The process matters more than the content. You think about your experience of communication over your lives. You know, think about a communication or a conversation you had maybe last week or last year. There's a chance you might not even remember any of the content. You don't remember what you were talking about. You probably, however, remember how you felt in that conversation. The process determines how we feel. When our process is healthy, our goal is mutual understanding. Communication is what we use simply because we're not mind readers. We're not telepathic, even though a lot of us act like we are. So our goal is mutual understanding. It's for me to understand your thoughts and feelings and for you to understand my thoughts and feelings. That's our goal. When our process is healthy, we can talk about just about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy, we can't talk about anything without arguing. So differences are rarely the problem in our communications. Differences in the vegan movement, it's our beauty, it's our richness. It creates a diversity of opinions that are really important for the kind of work that we're doing in the world. Differences are rarely the problem. It's how we relate to the differences that creates the problem. When we have a healthy process, we are open to understanding each other's differences and to communicating about the content in a way that helps raise our awareness and deepen our understanding. Point 4 is to protect your boundaries and the boundaries of others. So, for example, we need to hold toxic communicators accountable. We need to not be a bystander and not enable them. The reason that toxic communication goes viral is because so many bystanders allow it to go viral. We need to start taking more responsibility, particularly on our social media sites. You know, if somebody is posting commentary on your site, don't forward it. Don't allow it. Have a statement that you do not host commentary that is toxic. And let people know this, and ideally let the person know, and then delete it if they don't stop communicating in a toxic way. Don't turn away from it. Sorry, this is the forwarding is a little bit slow. We also need to block toxic communicators if people refuse to engage in a way that is productive. And we need to avoid avoid the temptation to read communication that is toxic commentary. Toxic commentary feeds the ego. It feeds the part of us that wants to feel better than. It feeds the part of us that doesn't feel good enough and kind of gets off on reading others being put down. It has an addictive pull to it, an addictive charge to it. And don't get pulled in by it. Avoid the temptation to read it, because the more you take it in, the more it feeds that part of you that will be attracted to rather than turned off by this kind of communication. If there are groups that tolerate toxic or encourage toxic communication, you decide whether you want to leave them or not, and I encourage you to leave them. And if you are a person who organizes meetings or you organize events, make sure that those are safe spaces for the people who attend, for the people who speak. We can do a lot as vegans to create a community that's safer for other vegans. And make a commitment to stay connected to your empathy as long as it feels safe to do this. For some people, staying connected to their empathy doesn't feel safe for them, in which case it's probably better not to be communicating. But if you feel it's safe for you to stay connected to your empathy, do so. Empathy is the antidote to judgment and contempt. Empathy is the antidote to contempt. If you notice you're feeling the charge of contempt, pause, take a step back, and really try to look at the world through that other person's eyes. People have really good reasons for doing what they do, even if we don't agree with them, even if we don't understand them. And remember that it's ideas rather than people who are in conflict. Pause before you communicate, especially when you're upset about something, and it can be a really good idea to put a sticky note next to your computer to remind you that on the other end of your communication is a living being. It's an individual with feelings and preferences and a life that matters to them, just like your life matters to you. Whenever possible, it's a better idea to speak to somebody privately rather than calling them out publicly. In some cases, we need to talk about a person's behaviors publicly. Even then, we can do it in a way that's not shaming to them. But whenever possible, try to speak to somebody one-on-one so they don't feel humiliated by the commentary or by the feedback that you might give them. And don't assume that having power makes somebody invulnerable to the toxic and debilitating effects of shame. I cannot tell you how many people I have spoken to who have a lot of social power, some of them who are leaders in the vegan movement and some of them who are very well known even outside of the movement, who have been devastated by things that have been said to and about them. Don't assume that just because somebody has power or privilege that this somehow makes them invulnerable to being shamed. In fact, often the opposite is true. People feel even more vulnerable to the toxic effects of shame. And honor the dignity of others, even as you're holding them accountable, even as you're giving feedback, even as you're disagreeing with an idea. We can do this in a way that honors dignity. Be extremely skeptical of anyone who argues that it is ever appropriate to communicate without compassion or respect. I have not seen a single study or a single piece of evidence that suggests that this is actually true. In fact, what I understand and have seen is to the contrary. Practicing compassion is not weakness or passivity. It is strength. It takes a lot more courage to be able to hold on to our empathy and to practice our compassion in the face of disagreements and in the face of differences than it does to just lash out and fight back. And finally, it's important to remember our shared bond. This is our shared bond as vegans. It's a bond, and it's a sacred bond that we share. And every time we communicate in a toxic way, we violate this sacred bond that is so important to us and so important to our movement and so important to the animals. As vegans, we carry a heavy burden around with us. We have to live with the awareness that every second of every day, horrific suffering is happening all around us, and that we can work our entire lives to end this suffering, and we probably won't live to see it. This is an awareness that the rest of the world is not carrying. It's an awareness that only other vegans understand. It is our sacred bond. Our collective knowing and our collective caring, this is this bond that we need to honor so that our movement is the safe and inspirational place that we need it to be to continue working for liberation. For many, many vegans, the world does not feel like a safe space. We walk away from our vegan circles and we get teased for caring. We get judged and shamed because we believe in practicing the values that everybody actually shares. We spend our lives often picking up the pieces of the mess that are left behind by others, and we never get a single thank you. And instead, we often get ridiculed or attacked for being who we are and what we do. It's hard enough for us to keep doing what we do, living in this carnistic culture. How can we possibly keep doing this work the way we need to do it if we can't even trust that the other vegans, the only other people who see what we see, are not on our side and are attacking us too? How can we keep doing this work that we need to do? We need to feel appreciated. Everybody needs appreciation to feel inspired. And we're never going to be thanked by the individuals whose lives we are saving. They can't thank us. They don't know who we are. They don't know what we're doing. So we need each other to see. We need to be seen by each other because the world doesn't see us. And we need to be appreciated by each other because the victims whose lives we're trying to save can't appreciate us and can't share with us the appreciation. We need to know that our efforts matter. And they do matter. They do matter. At the moment, we are the primary hope that the animals have. And we owe it to them to do our best work for them. We owe it to them to be our better selves for them. And we owe it to the other vegans around us who need us, just like we need them. I know that when I was on the receiving end of toxic communication, and it was devastating for me, and it really hindered my ability to do the work the way that I needed to do my work. But I couldn't. I was so consumed, I was so hurt by what I was seeing and what I was hearing, by the feeling that my own fellow and sister vegans were communicating with me and with each other this way. It wasn't until I started hearing from the vegans who are most of the movement, you know, and being thanked and being told that my work does matter and it does make a difference to them, that I started to feel more inspired again. We need to be able to do that for each other. And I want to kind of wrap this up by sharing with you my appreciation for you. You are the reason. The animals will never be able to thank me either. You are the reason that I can keep doing what I do. You are the reason that I stay inspired. You are the reason that I want to get out of bed in the morning and try to work for this movement and work to make the world a better place. And you are the reason that the animals hope that they have the hope that they have. So I want to thank you for you, for all that you're doing, for what you do for me, for what you do for the movement, and for what you ultimately do for each other, for other vegans, so that together we can finally achieve animal liberation. Thank you. Thank you. You're amazing. Thank you. You're amazing. So we have a few minutes now for questions, and we'll go until 1:30. If anybody wants to, there's no session after this, so I'll stay a couple of minutes later if people have questions that they want to continue to ask, and then immediately following, I'll be at the book signing table at Bite Back.